I think one of the things that the pandemic has showed us is that this can still happen. It doesn't matter, you don't have to be in place in the school, you can meet anywhere. We get less apologies now for governance meetings than we would have done in the past where people can't make it in time. I think there's more sympathy to the fact that everybody has busy lives, everybody generally has a career around being a governor as well, and so there's much more leeway for us to be able to meet partially remotely and partially in person.
If you travel half an hour or an hour to a meeting, then you sort of feel a pressure to make that meeting last, whereas you may only have one thing to discuss that would take 10 minutes, and people think, well, I've spent 2 hours travelling for a 10-minute meeting. Parent governors will have childcare responsibilities, and so for some of them, I think having the meeting on Zoom has made the meetings more accessible. It may be in the long term, if we think about it creatively, will help create more divergent boards as well.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this morning's session. So this morning we're going to be discussing remote governance and how it works in your, or could work in your boards. So I'm just going to share some slides and go through this. So bear with me a second. Let's have them running. Fantastic. Just go through some administration, some housekeeping with everybody. So closed quotes will be, closed captions will be available throughout the session. Speakers have been invited to do a short verbal description of themselves. This is for anybody with visual impairments. For this group, chat function is disabled. If you please enter any questions you have using the Q&A panel. There will be a Q&A session at the end of this as well. Just let you know the session has been recorded and links to the video will be sent out afterwards. We'll also be sending links to the slides, resources and contact details of our guest speakers. Please continue to follow the conference and share content on our social media using the hashtag GfS Conference 21. Also, I invite you to please complete the short post-session survey, which will appear after the session's ended. Great. Next slide, please. Fantastic. So today we're going to cover what a blended board is and what a remote governor is, advantages of remote governance and potential barriers, remote governance over the past 12 months with Linda from the Key, introduction to remote governance through remote governors Leo Fitton and Sam Martin. We're going to pass across to Rose Durbin, who's a chair of governance, and then we'll have a Q&A session. For anybody with visual impairments, my name's Sean Paskin. I'm the partnerships manager for schools. I'm 6 foot tall, blonde hair, bit-eared, blue eyes, and I'll be leading today's session. I also have in attendance Linda. If you'd like to introduce yourself, Linda.
Sorry, I was on mute. My name is Linda Untenauer. I am the lead content editor for the Key for School Governors. I am pretty short. I am of Korean American persuasion with dark hair and dark eyes.
Fantastic. We also have Leo Sitton. Leo is a remote governor across, is it a federation of schools there?
Yes, federated local board across 2 schools in Hastings. And yeah, and I'm white, male, pretty short as well, sitting in a blurry room in my office with some quite uncomfortable headphones on, but hopefully that at least means there's good sound quality.
Fantastic. Then we'll be passing over to Sam. Sam works for a Lloyds banking group and he's also a remote governor himself.
Hello, yes. My name's Sam Martin. I'm a governor for a joint academy council back in my hometown of Middlesbrough, and as a verbal description of my appearance, I am I wouldn't say short, I'd say 5'10", but I am, white, mid-20s, male, with brown hair textured on top, looking pretty fresh, just had a haircut. That's me, thank you.
Thanks, Sam. Finally, we'll go over to Rose Durbin. Rose is a chair of governors herself. She's actually a chair of governors for Leo's school as well, which is really, really good. Rose, would you like to introduce one?
Hi, I'm Rose. I'm white British, I'm grey-brown hair, and I'm contributing from a very sunny seaside at the moment. So if I appear very sunlit, that's why. And actually, if we're going to be heightist and sizes, I'm 5'10".
Thank you very much, everybody. Right, great. We'll start with the slides again, please. Fantastic. So this morning I want to discuss with you blended boards. So we believe a blended governance approach consisting of both local and remote governors can help the diversity and inclusivity of governing boards. A blended board would consist of a mix of local governors and remote governors and would be used to strengthen governing boards that have specific skills or diversity needs. Keeping the majority of your board local and also be able to connect with a minority remote governance supporting your board can only strengthen it. This would be a physical change for the governing body and the way the governing meetings are held, but with a good chair, they will remain dynamic and inclusive of all of its members. Physically, you'd either have the remote governor on a laptop or PC or monitor, interactive whiteboard in the room, or where you're holding the meeting. The governing board has done an amazing job of adapting to the remote concept throughout the current pandemic, and there have been lots of advantages that have been reported. The NGA did report on governance in unprecedented times even, and things like improved governor recruitment, travel time, governor attendance, more effective decision making were all part of the advantages mentioned. We're not saying that every board should be virtual, but this is not be the answer, but we do believe a blended board consisting of local and remote governors could be the answer for some, especially if there's a skills gap or diversity need on the board. Next slide, please. So, what is remote governance? So, remote governance is a model of school governance that allows, as I said, for at least the minority of the board members to attend the meetings remotely. Obviously, this was widely introduced on the back of the impact of COVID-19 on standard business practices and access to schools. It really caused us to question what's actually required from governance and how we can best tackle diversity and skill shortages. Benefits of remote governance were more focused and more effective decision making, no travel time, greater inclusivity for things like childcare commitments. Also, improved recruitment of new governors with no geographical restrictions in place and be able to provide governing boards with a larger, more diverse pool of people in which to recruit governors from is a quite good benefit. In addition, as I mentioned, governors were found to be more engaged and with a higher attendance rate. There's also an opportunity here to deliver more training to your governors. Many boards that are looking for a particular skill set in some areas, volunteers with these skills are hard to come by. So remote governance is a way for your board to add this skill from experienced volunteers elsewhere in the country. It can also increase diversity for your board if there's a need, and therefore help make it more inclusive and representative of the different backgrounds in your area. Next slide, please. Fantastic. So, of course, there are potential barriers to remote governance. We realise that there are barriers that could prevent this from working on all boards. What we have to remember is that we already have this technology. We're on this technology this morning. And we've also been looking at remote governance all over through the pandemic. But some of these barriers are to consider that the board's dynamics going to change. You know, you will not have everyone around the table anymore. You're going to have somebody on a laptop screen. That's going to be different. So how would this physically work? So I'm a remote governor myself. I attended a meeting recently and I was on the head teacher's laptop with the rest of my governors sat around me in semicircle. That was very different, but the ability of my chair to include me in all the conversations, and it really was inclusivity across the board. That is a key potential barrier as well. With a good chair, this can be resolved though. Also, in addition to this link roles, if anyone takes on a link role for their governing board, this can be difficult, not impossible. I recently been put on as a link governor for computer and IT. Perfect role for me to do remotely, but I would also be speaking to the person in school responsible for their IT system on a regular basis in order to see what potential problems are in school. And lastly, school visits. Obviously, as a remote governor, it's not possible to get to school. Now, you can have a walkthrough with technology on the phones, on laptops, etc. But it's much better if you utilise your local governors to do things like this. So there are many potential barriers, but also potential ways forward. Next slide, please. I'm going to introduce you from Linda from the Key, who's lead content manager there. She's going to talk to you about how they have seen remote governance affect governing boards for the past 12 to 18 months.
Thanks, Sean. Good morning, everybody. Probably best to go back to the period before the pandemic in order to get started. Just as I hate to use a very broad brush on this, but just as like a general sense of where governance was prior to the pandemic, there was a sort of reluctance to embrace technology and bring that into governance. And it's probably not fair to put that just on governing boards. That may have been attributable to schools altogether. But there was certainly a very large learning curve when the pandemic struck and governing boards suddenly found themselves trying to do things remotely, many not having embraced this before. But it was impressive how quickly everybody got on board with what was happening. And that wasn't just the case with governance specifically, because obviously we had governors that were attending their meetings remotely, but suddenly we had a broader interest in things like remote training. We had more participation in webinars, such as what we've got going on right here. We've had a new way of embracing society through our computers. And this actually benefited not just the governing boards themselves, but also there was a large sector of society that said, hey, this is great because suddenly I am included. For example, people who may have had physical barriers to being a part of governance or just being a part of the workplace suddenly found themselves on equal footing. And these are things that we should embrace moving forward, but just something that we observed as we moved through the pandemic. Now, in the early days of the pandemic, we had the most common questions that we had were related to things like, how do we do elections if we're not, in school? How do we do it safely if we can't use physical ballots? How do we carry out school visits remotely? Like, what's the most effective way to do this? And also, how do we effectively have meetings if we're doing them remotely? A big question around meetings also revolved around how frequently to have them in the course of the pandemic. And these were all questions that we managed one by one as they came in. As all of you are fully aware, the guidance changed pretty significantly, not just from day to day, but hour to hour. And we did the best that we could to stay caught up, and really, really admired school leadership from the head teacher to the governors on how dedicated everybody was to seeing their schools safely through the pandemic, how focused schools and governors were on things like safeguarding and ensuring that children who are entitled to free school meals continued to get those meals during the pandemic, and how determined governors were to stay on top of the situation through what was really a difficult time, because governors are the largest volunteer force in the United Kingdom. And, for all of the for all of the difficulties that we were encountering in our professional lives, governors had that doubled, because not only did they have children at school and or children at home, and they were homeschooling and they were trying to work from home, but they're also trying to see their schools through the pandemic. So really impressive job. And if you haven't had the opportunity to kind of look backwards and say, wow, you know, I really, really did something impressive through this period, I would encourage all of you to do that now, because you genuinely did. But the interesting thing is that now that we are moving back towards business as usual and looking towards a future without those common restrictions, the questions that we're getting in haven't really changed. People are still asking, how do we do elections? How do we do it safely without ballots? Whether or not we should continue to meet remotely? Can we go in for school visits? And the reason for that is twofold. First of all, I think that schools as a whole, and necessarily so and properly so, are more concerned about maintaining social distancing and things like this in order to prevent outbreaks. And that is, of course, having an impact on the governing board as well. But also, everyone seems to be looking for new and updated guidance to explain to governors what they should be. So I just want to take this opportunity now to reassure you that there hasn't been any. We haven't had any direct communication from the DFE in terms of how we should do governance moving forward since April. Since the DFE governance update blog. So those rules that came into effect at that point in time continue to be in effect now, which is basically follow your school's risk assessment to determine whether or not you can safely meet in person and when you can safely go into school. So back in June, we decided to carry out a quick survey to see how our governors were handling remote governance, and also to kind of put our finger on the pulse of governance now that we'd had a full year of doing it remotely. And so we wanted to know how you, our audience, felt about how remote governance was going. So the first question that we asked you was, to what extent does running your board meetings remotely, how has that worked well? And 55.2% of you felt that it was going, that it went really well. Actually, 23.9% of you strongly agreed with that statement, believed that remote governance was actually better. There was 13.1% of you that were neutral, but very, very few of you thought that remote governance didn't go well at all. We asked you how effectively you felt remote meetings had been in comparison to running them in person. Now on that one, most of you felt like it was neither more or less effective. It was just as effective as running it in person. About 32.8% of you thought that it was a little bit less effective, and 17.8% of you thought that it was a little bit more effective. But generally speaking, about half of you thought that it was either more effective or neither more nor less effective. Then we wanted to know what it was about remote governance that you found to be better. And absolutely, the most common response that we got was that it was easier to fit around your schedules. And this makes sense. Because many of you were already commuting to work, you were doing the school run and trying to fit governance meetings in on top of it. Being able to attend remotely and not have that commuting time on top of it was definitely a huge benefit for many, many of you. Another benefit that you saw was the time and the money saved in not doing that commute. Most of you were able to claim back your expenses when you make those visits, but even with that, it was still a significant savings for a lot of you. And then finally, it was just that meetings were more likely to be fully attended, where a lot of governing boards frequently saw absences during the regular meetings prior to the pandemic. Attendance really went up. Now, we're not necessarily going to say that that's the direct result of doing it remotely. We understand that could very well have been just the emergency situation and everyone feeling as if their contribution was much more significant during the pandemic. But we do think that if you look at your own experience with remote governance, that you'd be able to see how just getting to the meeting was probably easier when you were able to do it remotely. What we did think wasn't going to be or the things that didn't have as much of an effect on how positively you saw remote governance, as we thought, was going to be things like the lack of physical contact. We thought that governors would dislike being able to physically go in and see each other, and that wasn't really as much of a pain point as we expected. We also thought that access to technology and the use of that technology was going to prove to be difficult, and that also didn't seem to be a barrier. While there were certainly some grumbles about, it was sometimes difficult to read body language, or sometimes governors felt like they couldn't interject and add something to the meeting. As a whole, the use of technology turned out not to be a barrier to remote governance. But then, of course, we had to ask the same question in terms of what you disliked about running governing boards remotely. And to that, it was less about meeting each other physically, but the inability to go into the schools physically was very difficult for a lot of you. And that only makes sense because, that so much of what we do as governors is based on getting that feel for how the school is going. So a lot of you found that really difficult. And again, as I mentioned, the difficulty in interjecting during meetings when that was being done remotely, and that meetings were less likely to start or finish on time because they were, because they were remote. So back in June, we asked you how you think your board's meetings will start to run from September. And about 52% of you expected that it will continue to be a hybrid, depending on individual preferences. 29% of you thought that you would return to in-person meetings, and 16% said that you didn't know. For those who said that you believe that it would return to in-person meetings, the primary response was that it was because that was what the school leadership wanted, that school leadership wanted everybody to get back into school as quickly as possible. And so the governing board was going to go ahead and follow those same rules. So as far as what has changed from the DFE or what's been extended, one of the few things that we do have specifically for governors relates to exclusions hearings. The rules for remote meetings have been extended to March 2022. However, on the face of it, it looks like there's only a very, very narrow window under which you can have those meetings remotely now, because it looks as if two rules have to be in place. First, that you're not going to be able to meet statutory deadlines unless you meet remotely. And the reason for that is directly related to COVID. So we would recommend that you recognize those rules for the moment. As far as going in and meeting in person and doing school visits, as I mentioned earlier, we'd recommend that you go ahead and talk to your head teacher, follow your risk assessments, and take your senior leadership's lead in terms of when you can go back and do that safely. So as far as moving forward goes, we had someone ask us to discuss how to manage resistance to remaining on the, to continuing with remote governance. It's not that it's not that I can speak directly to an outright resistance, but what I can do, and Sean's already hit on a lot of these, is offer up some of the really positive aspects of continuing remotely. Specifically, the fact that attendance is so much easier, not just for those of you who who have professional jobs that find commuting difficult, but also for parents with young children that have had to struggle with finding childcare, for people who might have physical difficulties in getting to the meeting, for people that might find that the commute is incredibly difficult. This is an opportunity to truly be inclusive and to ensure that your board reflects not just, reflects the community around you, which does involve busy parents, busy professionals, people with physical disabilities, and people who actually find the use of technology as a way of enhancing their ability to participate in governance. Another thing that you should consider has to do with I'm sorry, I'm going to forget the word here. So let me just go ahead and move on with that. Another thing to consider is attendance, or I'm sorry, I already said attendance. let me take a little pause here for a second and put my thoughts back together again. I really am just going to forget the word. Good morning. I should have had a cup of coffee. But we do encourage and we do believe that most governors are going to continue to work remotely on some level. But we do realize that there are going to be some concerns, and we expect that the Department for Education is actually going to address these. We are expecting to get some updated guidelines from the DFE, probably within the governance handbook as soon as that's released. We don't have any real clue about what that's going to be, but some things that I anticipate personally will be things like limitations on which roles can be done remotely. For example, I would imagine that a safeguarding lead a safeguarding link governor would probably need to be able to visit a school physically in order to remain in that role, specifically because of safeguarding concerns. I also think that there might be some restrictions on how much of the board can be remote, in the same way that you've got the 1/3 restriction for what percentage of the board can be staff. I expect that there will be something very similar for remote attendance. But with that said, I still think that the DFE itself recognizes how remote governance has changed. And just on a level completely aside from governance itself, I'd also like to point out that remote work is actually the future of work. And because it's the future of work, it is the future for these children that we lead and that we safeguard. And that we, as governors, have the responsibility of showing a good working model, of modeling what the future looks like for them. And failing to embrace remote governance now could be seen as a way of not encouraging that for our children in the future and not embracing that reality for them. So we have yet to see how things are going to move forward, but I do expect that at least the hybrid model is here to stay.
Thank you very much, Linda. Completely agree with everything you said. And for anyone who's interested, I've shared the report that Linda was talking about with the key did in the chat function. It's very interesting. Please do give it a read. Can we go on to the next slide, please? Fantastic. So I'm going to introduce you now to Leo Sutton. Leo is a remote governor for St Leonard's Hastings Academy and the Hastings Academy. Leo, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, so for a little bit of background, I taught down in Hastings for 2 years as part of the Teach First programme, and then decided that I wanted to move to London and pursue a different career after that, but very much missed the connection to the school, to education. And so back in February of 2020, saw that there were vacancies for the local board covering the school that I taught at, and was obviously really excited to apply. And back then had no idea what was coming, clearly, and had no idea that that actually I wouldn't see the school again for more than a year after that. But so I think, yeah, just I'm going to talk now about my kind of positive and negative experience of that remote governance then, and try and address some of those questions that I've seen coming in. But I think it's going to vary so much, and just over the past few months, we've seen things vary so much from the school's point of view in terms of when they want people coming in or not coming in, and how much the members of the board are up for meeting in person or remotely. But to go back to the start, the big positive is that actually, given that I made my application in February 2020, I would not be a governor now if the school and the trust and the board hadn't made remote governance a success. And not just the remote governance, but also the recruitment, the application, the onboarding, and actually making me feel welcome and like I knew what I was doing. And thank you, Rose, but like I was then a a part of that board, and I think that actually there's going to be many other people in that position who, for a lot of that time, wouldn't have been able or comfortable to meet physically. And given that I am in London and the school is in Hastings, I am very lucky that my employer is happy to provide me time off to fulfill commitments as a school governor. But as an example, we had our first meeting of the year on Tuesday this week, and that was 2 hours out of my day, which is something that is really easy to fit in around other commitments, as opposed to, if I had probably, gone to visit the schools, gone to a meeting in person, that could well have been half a day or a full day. And so now I have that additional time that I can use in other ways, and in other capacities to support the board. So I think that there's so many kind of real positives, but, and it's really been alluded to, the challenge is that I am the SEND link governor, and so I've had many Zoom Teams conversations with the Sencos at the 2 academies that we're covering, and actually, as soon as the opportunity came up to go and visit the school, I took that opportunity in the summer of last year. As soon as they said kind of people are welcome again, I felt like I wanted to be there and to meet the people in person. And I also felt like that massively helped build my relationships with those people. Not to say that it couldn't have continued online, but I would have done it in a very different way to make sure that actually the informality of what we could do in person could have been done online before. But those conversations that I had over the course of a day in last summer before the end of term actually counted for so much, and I think will count for a lot going forward, even if we then have a mixture of those in-person and remote conversations. Because now I've kind of seen, built some relationships with these people, seen them in person, have a better idea of what's going on with them. I actually had I hadn't even thought of it though before what you were talking about, Linda, in terms of the future of work though, because obviously I have a professional job in London, and what colleagues have wanted has varied enormously. And I know there are colleagues now that intend to do their role exactly the same as they did before, but maybe coming to the office once a month, maybe less than that as required. And I think that absolutely is going to be how we use our time efficiently going forward, and is going to mean that hopefully we all have more time for the important things. And clearly the technology is a challenge, and I really felt for I can't remember who raised the question saying that I was 30 feet away on a laptop and nobody could hear me, and schools don't have the technology that they need. But a quality conference call speaker is £100, £150. I think that every school can make a good investment in one of those, not just for their governors meetings, but I'm sure that there's going to be many more use for things like that going forward. So yeah, I have been a remote governor for the past 12 months. I think that it's been an amazing experience, but I very much see that what's going to work best for me is that kind of hybrid model where there's taking advantage of the technology, but also really recognizing that the relationship building and the getting a feel for things that you referenced, Linda, is so important as well.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Leo. And you're exactly right. It's going to be the hybrid way of working that I think governors are going to be more accustomed to moving forward. Next slide, please. Fantastic. I'd like to introduce Sam Martin. Sam is a remote governor at Outwood Academy Ormsby and Outwood Academy Normanby. So, Sam, over to you.
Thank you, Sean. Thanks, Sean. And thanks, Leo and Linda. It's, I think you guys have covered off a lot of it already. However, I just want to echo a lot of the statements, a lot of the sentiment that has come from Leo and Linda. I'm actually in quite a similar position to Leo. So, been a governor since late 2019, and I actually became involved in governors for schools and school governance through my employer. There was a colleague who was also a governor. She's based in St Helens, it's the Northwest Wing. She was a parent governor because her young girls were at the school. However, there's a governors network within the bank. And so through that, I was introduced to Governors for Schools, who then, linked me up with a couple of schools in my hometown of Middlesbrough. Now, I live in Edinburgh for work, and, pre-COVID, the good old days when we could travel around, I spent a lot of time between Edinburgh and London, and then, fitting a lot of the school visits. Well, there was 2 school visits before COVID kicked in, by going to Middlesbrough and using it as an excuse to go back to my hometown. Now, as part of my governor role, I've actually taken on the link roles of careers and employability, and also mental health and wellbeing, which has been highly rewarding. And I found it really interesting when Leo was talking about having the opportunity to go back in over the summer for the first time. Now, I haven't been back at all. And a lot of that is due to, we've maintained remote meetings. I'm still not clear whether we're going to have remote meetings going into this year or not. I know based in Scotland, Nicola's told us to not go back to the offices yet, whereas my colleagues in England can. So there is a bit of discrepancy there. But naturally, I am pretty used to this whole remote way of working. I mean, even pre-pandemic, my employer was incredibly flexible. The team I was working in at the time, as I've said before, a lot of them were in London, some of them were dotted around the country. And actually, I was the only person in Edinburgh. So I was very au fait with dialing in remote meetings. In fact, I didn't really have to tell anyone which office I was in. I could just run around and do whatever I liked, because, you have that autonomy. But yeah, so in schools, I was, doing in-person meetings until COVID. However, what I will say is even with and without COVID, I know it was listed as a potential barrier, but conducting my link roles remotely has actually been, I see that as been a key strength. I mean, covering 2 schools, I would have a link lead at each of the schools. And actually being remote allows me to be incredibly flexible in terms of when I actually go and meet each of those leads, because you'd have, different conversations with each of them. And it would be great if you could link them all together in one meeting, even virtually. But sometimes that's not the case. So, being remote actually offers the ultimate flexibility, not just for myself, but also the leaders within the schools. I know on their diversity as well, there's also a potential, a positive. Yeah, I know if anyone was at the diversity session we had yesterday lunchtime, if you have the opportunity, if you haven't seen it, listen to it. There's a guy, Adrian, he was very passionate and very articulate about his points. It's super engaging. I absolutely encourage anyone to go view that. But yeah, remote governance it absolutely encourages diversity. It allows you to fill those skills gaps. And I think it really does enable that inclusivity. I know there was discussion around disabled governors and, remote, allowing them to join virtually. It creates more of an inclusive environment for those kind of volunteers. But I completely understand the potential barriers and the challenges. For example, I use Teams a lot. So the schools I use, the schools I'm linked in with, use things like Google. So, I understand how a lot of older people now struggle with technology, and they say, I can't do it because I'm so used to doing Teams. And they now talk about Gmail and Google Meets, and I don't know how to do it. But, that's been quite a learning curve, as it has for a lot of people. But once you get around a lot of those general challenges and the general attitudes and the resistance towards virtual methods and dialing in remotely, I think it has been, pretty good on the whole. I have said, link roles for me, it's been easier, but even with the main meetings, I can echo what Leo said around being able to fit everything in with your diary. I know going back to the office, at the back end of the pandemic, we are focusing our return based on, the needs. So, we're only going into the office for the work that we need to do in the office. We appreciate that sometimes there is a need for that face-to-face element. So we're really trying to differentiate, what is good for face-to-face and what is good for remote methods. And so, within my day job, if there's stuff that we can do at home on our laptops, if it's focus time, that kind of thing, then absolutely you can be remote. We are focusing on going into the office for collaboration. We're focusing on going into the office for those times where, being face-to-face really adds that value. And I know there was a question I really wanted to answer. I think Tracy Rose had asked around, I think she was the only colleague using dialing in remotely, and there was one laptop at their school, and it was difficult for her to listen in. Something we've been doing within the bank, and this is quite a behavioural change for a lot of people, so please bear with me, is that, even if, let's say you have 10 people in a team and 9 of those people are face-to-face and 1 person is remote, all of those 9 people face-to-face in whichever office you're in will sit at a desk, in a room all together, but they will all dial in on their laptops. So it is really inclusive for that 1 person that has to be remote. And it really does help with that engagement. So that's a really quick win for a lot of you who, may have 1 or 2 people dialing in remotely. I know that's something that my board is considering, because we do have two schools that we cover, and it means that, if we're having a face-to-face meeting at Ormsby, for example, all of our Normanby colleagues don't then need to travel. They don't need to come to Ormsby. They can dial in remotely alongside any governors. I know, Sean, at the start of the session, you did introduce the board, the model with the hybrid model with so many remote governors. I personally, Middlesbrough's my hometown, I use it as an excuse to go back home. So personally, for me, I am more of a hybrid role. I think that's something my board is totally happy with. I'll make the effort to go in, once or twice a year, but alongside going back in the office, I really want to make sure that if I am going to travel to Middlesbrough to go see the school, it needs to be a really value-adding day, because as Leo said, if you go face-to-face, you are taking a whole day out of your day job. So I think, I've already talked about some success stories and plans for the future, but if I was to give you all any tips, I would just say, be really open about your ways of working. If any of you and your boards have board members who work in organisations and they've been experimenting with virtual remote ways of working throughout the pandemic, ask them to share some of their knowledge and some of their quick wins and successes from their job and apply that into the school environment, if possible. I think that experimentation is just really important to figure out, what works for you guys. And it is really important to note that there's no one-size-fits-all model. You just need to have that self-awareness to reflect and experiment. So yeah, I think that's me.
Thank you very much, and very, very interesting insights there, and really good advice as well. Very conscious of the time now, but I'm just going to pass across to Rose. Rose is a chair of governors at, is it 2 schools, Rose, or is it 3?
Well, it's I'm chair of governors of, chair of 2 federated local boards in Hastings, 1 primary, 1 secondary. As Leo has already said, there's a nice segue there, because you're seeing assurance in action about whether we both agree whether our board dynamics are working. And I think I've got sort of 8 minutes to offer you my take on positives, potholes, and perspectives on remote governance, so no pressure. 18 months ago, I guess like many of you, Zoom, Teams, COVID-19 risk assessments, bubbles, lateral flow tests, you're on mute, bandwidth, the next slide please, weren't on my radar at all, but they are now. And I think we've probably all watched at least once the infamous Handforth Parish Council Zoom meeting, where there was deep, deep learning and insight about how not to give and gain assurance, how not to use authority wisely, and how not to exercise good governance. What matters to me, and you've heard a little bit from Leo, but to our local board, is that we think big for children, we believe in them, and we work together so their rights are realised, views shape decisions made about their lives, and they respect the rights of others. We want to be helping their learning and life chances. We want them to be positive about themselves now, their community, and their future. So what worked for us? Well, the meetings bit generally worked. We moved pretty swiftly towards team, although Zoom on balance is more user-friendly for parents, carers. We mostly kept the new normal remote ground rules, pre-reading papers, staying respectful and present, watching our airtime, using mute, recognizing that video on humanizes experience for everybody. And as chair, I worked to try and make sure everybody felt included, able to share their views and shape decisions by being as thoughtful as possible about the agenda, the timings, and the invitational culture of joining in. I noticed that meetings became shorter, more focused, better attendance, but there's also a balance. More focus shouldn't exclude or stifle some of that connectivity and informality. That's a key part of a face-to-face meeting. We needed to stay fluid as well as focused, encourage discussion as well as questions and answer, narrative and story as well as facts and statistics. I think over the last 18 months, we've charted how children and staff well-being rose up our agenda, and actually parental and family reach improved in many ways. We learned that remote check-ins work really well with senior managers and leaders, not so sure they worked at every level, need to think through that. And where they were needed, meetings about complaints and concerns and exclusions that Linda touched on were better attended by parents and carers. And that's an important learning point for us. But of course, the real work isn't about meetings. I think it's important to kind of get, meetings have their place, but the real work of any board gets done between meetings. So it's essential to keep focus on our moral purpose of championing and challenging on behalf of children's learning and life chances, but also understanding and being thoughtful and insightful about what they and their families are and were grappling with. Online learning worked well for some of our children. More time with a mostly harmonious family, more hugs, more PE with Joe, more time outside in the garden, more clapping and more looking out for neighbours. But COVID-19, where we are, and I'm sure where you are too, exacerbated our local health inequalities. And it's been really, really tough for children and families who rely on multi-agency support. School closures, while really necessary to halt infection rates, have heightened risks. And our staff worked really hard. We worked really hard, but staff in particular reached out. But we know that some children stayed home and stayed at risk. As a local board, we've had to think differently and deeply about food and job insecurities. The rise in domestic violence, mental health and well-being, contact arrangements for some of our children in care, impact of bereavement, and parental anxiety and resistance to coming back to school. So it's important to chart our shift to asking different assurance questions about existing and newer needs of our children and families, so that we really are thoughtful about who's fallen deeper into the cracks. Who's missing out on daily contact with trusted adults who are often key people in school, people that have their back? Who's kind of lost out on access to key workers and support services? Leo's mentioned he's a lead for SEND, and I'm a lead for safeguarding. And, you know, there are new risks around. There's anxiety and stress for some families and children. There's a digital device, as well as the safe spaces to learn. When we did talk to children, the biggest source of annoyance and frustration and anxiety was smaller siblings making a noise, older siblings making a noise, and safe spaces to learn. And we've also recognised some increases in SEND needs and learning losses. And we know that our community is facing some heightened challenges in terms of food and job insecurity. It's important to appreciate that staff workloads were escalating. They were amazing, but nevertheless doing new things, as Sam has pointed out really well. So we recognise we didn't need all the paperwork. What was said was just as important as what people took hours to write out. We kept LB meetings going, but subgroups found it harder to meet. And we recognised, and still do, the importance of saying thank you, often, personally, and in heartfelt ways. We took time to find out from staff what they would really value. And our community development priority actually shifted towards parental reach and engagement. Virtual wellbeing days worked really well. And we did manage, at the end of the summer term, to have the prom for our year 11s. That was worth more to them than sometimes their GCSE results. So what was and does remain challenging is how we remain a positive force of support and challenge, especially when our school leaders are feeling always on, and they felt always on now for nearly 2 years. Guidance and procedures were ever changing. That's really tough for school leaders and our families. Our secondary board is fairly new, so as Leo mentioned, we haven't met in real life. We did try for a socially distanced meeting on the end of Hastings Pier, but the weather and the wind won out. Virtual head teacher recruitment was a challenge. We did it, but I probably wouldn't want to repeat. We've had to work at staying strategic without losing sight of the critical and changing here and now. And remote safeguarding. Yeah, you can tick a policy, you can fill in an audit form, but it's much, much, much harder to grasp culture and practice. And there's always the risk about the vulnerabilities and risks that are happening out of sight, because we don't want them to be out of mind. Pupil voice, Zooms felt studied rather than the interactive sessions we typically enjoy and learn from. Learning losses for all of our children. So looking ahead, our top tips? Well, it's important to take stock, as Linda's mentioned. What do we start? What do we stop? What do we do more of? What do we do less of? For us, it's a blend. We want to hang on to some of that streamlining gains, but we've probably, although we think given a recruitment, retention and development and aspects of parental engagement may be more attractive, we also think a hybrid approach will really work for us. How do you decide which is best, remote or in person? I think you have to ask some questions. For us there, how easy is it for children, for families, for staff to raise concerns, to ask questions, share proposals, exchange ideas, reflect and learn, celebrate success? Once you answer those, it's fairly easy to decide, can this be remote? Does this need to be in person? We want to hang on to our massive tech curve, but not lose sight of the core essentials of compassion, kindness, appreciation. And it is possible to create a culture of agency, belonging and connection virtually, but the human touch does matter. It reinforced, I guess, as we've always known it, that strategic priorities and plans aren't set in stone. They should be looked at as preferred futures that need shaping and flexing to current reality. And high on our priority list is children and staff safety and well-being, identifying and meeting learning losses and needs, listening, hearing, following up on people's voice and views, keeping our parental reach, but also regaining some of that community engagement and making sure children come to school, stay in school, and succeed in school. We've learned a lot about remote education and remote governance. We're not planning to leap to tech first because we've listened to children and staff and they're pleased to be back in school. Generally, they were more miserable and less motivated at home. Some children benefited, but more lost out than gained. So it's a blended future, I think, going forward. As Roosevelt once said, do what you can with what you have from where you are. And anyway, as a 6-year-old said to me in July, I'd finally visited a school and he was coming up with new endings to old proverbs. And he said, if at first you don't succeed, we'll just get new batteries. So there you go. Keep your batteries on charge and do a blend. Thank you.
Thank you, Rose. Very insightful. Thank you. Next slide, please. Just because I'm aware that we are running very short of time now, I'll try to get through and answer as many questions as I can. And we have gone through a lot of questions here throughout the session today. I just want to take this opportunity to thank all the speakers for coming. You've been great. Your insight and knowledge into this is fantastic. And I'm in complete agreement. The hybrid way of working, I think, will emerge as a top contender. And elements of virtual monitoring will soon be going forward. Have more on board work remotely, it will be better. So no, we've got 2 minutes left before the webinar will end. Any last minute tips or hints from anybody?
Use Zoom and a Jabra conference call speaker.
I see that there's quite a lot about monitoring and about how you kind of see evidence. And I think it's about thinking, if you are doing remote monitoring, about how you give and gain assurance. And that's about, I think, triangulation. So you may want to be talking to the subject leads, but you might also want to be talking to some of the teaching staff and the children and just checking out their answers. So I do think it's possible. I think it's trickier with safeguarding and harder with people voice. But I think in terms of curriculum monitoring and just looking at where the learning losses and gaps are and what might be needed, I think it's using that process of assurance and triangulation that can help.
That's great, and I completely agree. I do think we're out of time now. Session will end in a minute. So I just want to take this opportunity to just thank everybody very much. Links and resources will be shared, and of course, if anybody's attending another session today, please do go online and see what the sessions are running. I think we've got a very good campaign launch at the end of the day as well. So thank you very, very much for attending, everybody, and I do hope you enjoy the rest of your day.